All right, Saagar, what's on your radar?
Well, one of my biggest pet peeves in Washington is when everyone comes together and denies basic common sense, because acknowledging it would be too damaging to their own careers and their prestige. This happens pretty much every single day. But one of the most glaring examples in the last several years has been not to acknowledge he who must not be named. Mr. Bezos, Jeff Bezos, former CEO of Amazon, the richest man in the world. You see, it's considered déclassé to imply as a journalist that the richest man in the world's ownership of the second most powerful newspaper in America had only to do with Bezos' altruistic streak, not that he may be able to use ownership of that paper to accomplish business and political ends. That implication, when thrown by Donald Trump or Bernie Sanders, was struck back viciously by not only those at the Post, but everyone else in media. It was called a conspiracy theory at the time. How dare Sanders make an accusation in August 2019? Without evidence, the Post cried in their own newspaper, saying no such evidence existed. Pay no attention to the man behind the curtain. The evidence I need is human nature, but apparently that's not enough. Well, finally, we have some very interesting new information. A forthcoming book on Amazon and Jeff Bezos goes into explicit detail of how Bezos used his ownership of the paper specifically to combat his own personal crisis, showing that yes, in fact, owning a large newspaper has a lot of benefits. Let me explain. You may all recall Bezos a few years back got caught up in a racy sexting scandal. The National Enquirer, he reported in the midst of his marriage melting down that he'd exchanged sex with his then married girlfriend, Lauren Sanchez. Obviously, that's a pretty wild story. And actually, a side note, the day or two after that came out, I weirdly worked out next to him at the gym. But that is a story for another time. Speculation abounded at the time. Who leaked these text messages to the National Enquirer? Immediately, it came out Lauren Sanchez's brother, Michael, appeared to be intimately involved, and it was later confirmed by author Brad Stone and legal filings. Basically, he sold his own sister's racy texts to the National Enquirer and then charged his sister $25,000 a month to negotiate with the National Enquirer on her behalf. Basically, he's a scumbag, but that's neither here nor there. The interesting part is this. At the time, you may all recall the National Enquirer was a real target of the mainstream media because of their long alliance with Trump. They were at the heart of a payment regarding Stormy Daniels, that story. Every New York Times reporter on earth was trying to take them down because of that alliance with the then president, meaning that people would pretty much believe anything about the National Enquirer. Bezos is not a dumb guy. He didn't make $100 billion on luck alone. So he did what any smart person does in the middle of a crisis. You change the story. Bezos, instead of signing a deal with the National Enquirer to stop publishing his texts, he came out and said, "Screw you, National Enquirer," coming clean about the scandal and implying in an open letter that his texts had been obtained as political retribution against him by the Saudi government and leaked to the National Enquirer. The theory is that Bezos is the owner of the Washington Post, employer of Jamal Khashoggi, who was murdered by the Saudi government. And since Bezos was speaking out against Khashoggi's murder, this was personal retribution by MBS against him. It's a great theory. It was widely celebrated at the time. As the New York Times noted in their own write-up of the story, as Bezos went public in an affair, reporters at the Washington Post covered national security were investigating whether Bezos was hacked by the Saudis and leaked those texts to the National Enquirer. Even today, if you ask someone in D.C., they would probably tell you it was the Saudis that went after Bezos. But here's the thing. There's no evidence for that claim. As Brad Stone has reported, it's not even remotely true. Sure, the Saudis hacked him, but all legal filings and emails released point to a single leaker of those texts to the National Enquirer. It's Jeff Bezos' girlfriend's brother, Michael Sanchez. I know this may sound convoluted, but here is the summary. Jeff Bezos found himself in trouble because he was having an affair in broad daylight and he got caught doing it. He then turned public opinion on his side by casting himself as a righteous hero defending Jamal Khashoggi's legacy against big bad MBS. But he didn't do that through spinning lies of his own. The very paper that he owns investigated and propagated those claims on his behalf. And worse, journalists across the media, absent a very select few, ran PR for Bezos. They hated Saudi Arabia, they hated the National Enquirer, they were willing to look past Bezos' affair, and they bought his explanation hook, line, and sinker. It went from what could have been the biggest cheating scandal since Tiger Woods got caught in 2009 to one in which Bezos is a hero. In a way, you have to respect the game. That's an incredible outcome. But more important is this: the people whose job it was to investigate those claims, however trivial they might be, were being paid by Jeff Bezos. And if they weren't being paid, they were working for friends of Jeff Bezos. Or they worked at other places where they eventually wanted to go work for Jeff Bezos. It is circular PR. By buying a single major media outlet, you actually end up owning people at the rest of them because it's just one tiny little family. And while I doubt this entire story or episode will ever be widely known, we now have at least definitive proof that ownership of the Washington Post for Jeff Bezos has paid off in fantastical ways. He used it to help his image at the greatest personal crisis in his life, and he used it to run cover for him. Now, you think this is the first time. What happens if there's ever a bombshell story about Amazon? Or what happens if something else happens in his personal life? It pays to be the richest man in the world, and it pays even more to own the Washington Post. And Crystal, I know that this story is about his sex. And by the way, whenever I saw him, I was like, you ever heard of Signal, dude? Like, come on. You're the richest man in the world. Even I have disappearing messages on mobile. Anyway, so all of that being said, it was shocking to me because you read this story, and in a way, it's deeply cynical. He's using his ownership of the Post and Jamal Khashoggi's murder to cover up his boner pics, which he sent to his girlfriend. And look, I'm not judging him, whatever, but more what I'm saying is you're using your ownership of that paper and then having the paper investigate those claims, which are total BS, false. Anyway, somebody needs to have a conversation. There needs to be a family conversation in the Sanchez household between Lauren and Michael.
Wow.
First of all, who shares your sex with your brother? That's weird. And then whose brother sells them to the National Enquirer?
Horrible.
And then charges you in order to defend them. Weird.
A lot going on there.
Yeah.
But what you point to is this is a little window.
Yes.
A little window. And this is really the first time. There have been indications before of the way they were covering a potential Amazon deal with the penny. There were little potential, warning signs.
But there was no
or
smoking
even
gun.
The way they covered Bernie Sanders. But no, this is the first time you can really directly see the way that Bezos owning the Post dramatically impacted our understanding of a news story.
Yes.
And if you think that this is the only time that he's going to use the Post for his own ends, you're a fool.
Right.
And so, this was always, I'll never forget during the campaign when Bernie Sanders suggested that Bezos owning the Post may impact their coverage. And the media freak out over that. How could you suggest this is an attack on the free media, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, when it's the most obvious thing in the world. And here's the proof. If you think this is the only time that he's going to use the Post to get what he wants and portray a story in the manner that he sees fit, you're a fool.
And I know people don't want to get into the tabloid stuff, but this is important for this reason. He was CEO of Amazon when this was happening. Negative stories about a publicly traded stock, and especially racy ones like this, it could have, if what had happened to Tiger had happened to him, he could have conceivably been ousted as CEO of Amazon very, very easily by this board of directors. Or they could have said, look, man, we can't handle this. You got to go. But he leveraged all of his power. According to that same story, he called up Barry Diller, who's the owner of the Daily Beast, and got them to start investigating it. He used the Washington Post to investigate it. He used all of his connections in the media industry and more. And most importantly, journalists at the time who hated the National Enquirer because of their connection to Trump, hated Saudi Arabia, were willing to buy it. I remember it so specifically. People were standing for Jeff Bezos. They were like, good for Bezos, screw the National Enquirer, he's being blackmailed, all of that. And he was, but by his girlfriend's brother, not by the Saudis, but it's a very nice little story. It was big bad MBS. And then even the UN came out and they were like, yes, MBS hacked Jeff Bezos' phone.
Oh, I remember that,
There's no evidence that the Saudis passed on the texts to the National. Zero. And yet, you had all these people in the papers writing stories. Oh, National Enquirer's long history of work. No, they do what they always do. They find some scumbag like Michael Sanchez, and they buy pictures off of him.
Buy a story.
Buy the simplest explanation.
Yeah. Well, and it's not just any newspaper, it's the Washington Post. So if you set the tone of the coverage there, every other paper in the country is essentially going to pick it up. I mean, every other news outlet in the country is basically going to follow the lead of one of the most preeminent newspapers, certainly in this country and really around the world. So when they started saying, oh, this is what's going on, I mean, but also just think of how despicable it is to weaponize Jamal Khashoggi's death like that for your own ends is really despicable. And like, I really don't give a shit what Jeff Bezos is doing in his personal life and all of that. And if they did oust him from Amazon because of it, I think that would be silly and ridiculous. But to me, the important point of this story is to see that revelation about how he's used the Post and what that means about his relationship to that entity as they're right now picking their top editor. Is he going to have a say in that? What's that relationship going to be like? How's that going to impact their coverage? All of these things incredibly significant. And as you pointed out before, with Amazon HQ2 launching over in Crystal City, just across the river, and there's like very little coverage of that in the Washington Post.
By the hometown paper.
Very interesting.
Yeah, really interesting.
Coming up, Andrew Feldman, Emily Jashinsky, they're going to be here for Team Rising when Rising returns.